Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you again for joining us for this daily update. And I want to start today, as I always do, by giving you some of the key statistics in relation to COVID-19 in Scotland. As at 9 o'clock this morning, there have been 9,697 positive cases confirmed, which is an increase of 288 on the figures reported yesterday. A total of 1,710 patients are currently in hospital with confirmed or suspected COVID-19, which is a decrease of 38 from yesterday. A total of 141 people last night were in intensive care with confirmed or suspected cases of the virus, and that is also a decrease of 7 since yesterday. Again, these figures for hospital admissions and admissions into intensive care are giving us real and growing cause for optimism that the current lockdown is working to suppress the virus. That's the good news. Perhaps the less good news is that that also tells us why we must stick with these lockdown restrictions, because, as I've said many times standing here before, any easing up on that at all right now would risk us putting all of that progress into reverse and the virus quickly running out of control again. So please stick with the restrictions, because as you can see, they are working. I'm also, in some other good news, able to confirm today that since the 5th of March, a total of 2,271 patients who had tested positive for the virus and been admitted to hospital have now been able to leave hospital, and I wish all of them very well. However, on a much sadder note, I also have to report that in the last 24 hours, 64 deaths have been registered of patients who had been confirmed through a test as having the virus. That takes the total number of deaths in Scotland under that measurement to 1,184. As I've said before, we provide these statistics for a very important reason, because it helps us know, and it helps us tell you what is happening to the virus, how it is progressing across the country and what impact it is having. But the people behind these statistics could be the loved ones of any of us, and that's what I always bear in mind when I report the numbers to you every day. Each and every one of these statistics was a real person, and across the country right now, their deaths are being mourned by families whose lives will never be the same again without them. So once again today, I want to convey my deepest condolences to everyone who is grieving for a loved one as a result of this virus. I also want to thank again, as I always do and always will, our health and care workers. Again last night, I, along with thousands and thousands of people across the country, took part in the applause at 8 o'clock. And that has become a regular and also a very special feature of the week, and of Thursday evenings in particular. It's just one small way in which we can show our appreciation for the extraordinary work that all of you do. And I want again today to give my sincere thanks to all of you. But that Thursday night applause has also become a way for all of us in streets and communities up and down the land to briefly come together, to share some kindness and show some solidarity. And at a very grim and difficult time, these really are special moments indeed. Now, there are two issues that I want to briefly cover today before handing on to my colleagues here and opening up to questions. The first issue is really just to recap the paper that the Scottish Government published yesterday on how we might begin to go through a process over the weeks to come of restoring some level of normality to our everyday lives, while we also continue to contain and suppress the virus and minimise the harms that it does. I can tell you today that since the document was published this time yesterday, more than 250,000 of you have viewed the paper on the Scottish Government's website. So thank you to those of you who have taken the time to engage with this. And I would encourage those who haven't had the opportunity to do so yet to take some time to read the document. I noted yesterday that most people will never read a government document, but if you're ever going to do it at all, this is the time. So please take some time to read what we set out, the principles that are going to guide us, some of the factors we have to take into account. And if you've got views on that you would like us to consider in this next phase of our work, then please don't hesitate to tell us what they are. As I said yesterday, this publication is an attempt to have a grown-up conversation with the wider public in Scotland. We want to be really frank with you every step of the way about the complexities and the uncertainties of the decisions that lie ahead. We need to be clear now that lockdown remains essential for the reasons I mentioned a moment ago, and that even as we are able to start to ease some of these restrictions, we're going to have to do so very carefully, very cautiously, probably very slowly and gradually. We're going to have to take what I described this morning as baby steps in doing this. We've got to try to seek a new normal because how we're living our lives right now has consequences and can't go on forever. But we have to recognise the virus has not gone away. So there will be changes in how we live our lives that will be necessary for some time to come until science in the form of treatments and a vaccine offer new solutions to us. So this really is about all of us because it will impact on the lives of each and every one of us. So that is why it is important that everybody feels part of this process. And it's important for me as First Minister, in contrast to the certainties that politicians usually like to express, that I can also be frank with you about the uncertainties and the complexities of the decisions that lie ahead. Those decisions will make demands on all of us and the lives that we lead. So I want that process to be open as possible. And the paper we published yesterday that so many of you already have taken the opportunity to read is the start of that process. As I said yesterday, in the days, literally, and weeks ahead, we will set out much more detail on the different options that we will consider and the modelling and the scientific advice that underpins and informs those decisions. And of course, as we develop and assess those options, we will continue to engage as widely as possible across different sectors and groups of society. But lastly, I want to re-emphasise an important point. It's one that I made yesterday, it's one that I've made already in my remarks to you today. Moving on from where we are now will be possible only if and only when we get this virus under control and we have more confidence that that is the case. And so it remains absolutely vital that all of us continue to comply with the public health guidance and rules that are in place. And to reiterate, that means staying at home unless you're going out for essential purposes such as exercise once a day or buying food and medicines. It means that if you do go out, don't meet up with people from other households and please stay 2 metres apart from other people. And it means washing your hands regularly and thoroughly. By following these rules, we can continue, as we're doing right now, to slow the spread of this virus, and we can hasten the day when we return, if not to complete normality in the foreseeable future, then at least to some semblance of normality in our everyday lives. Now, the second item I want to briefly cover today is our work to ensure that Scotland's NHS and our care sector continue to have the supplies that they need to care for people in this time. Over the past month, the Trade Minister in the Scottish Government, Ivan McKee, has been leading work for us to ensure that any shortages can be overcome and that supply chains can continue to meet demand. And that's involved at times sourcing equipment from alternative supply chains and where necessary, of course, going overseas to source the equipment we need. For example, you may have seen last weekend a major consignment of PPE arrived at Prestwick Airport from China. That included 10 million fluid-resistant face masks as well as equipment for use in intensive care units and laboratories. And I can confirm that just an hour ago, another of those consignments arrived at Prestwick, and that included 100,000 testing kits as well as another 10 million face masks. Of course, alongside international procurement, we're also working to boost Scotland's domestic supply lines. About a month ago, we put out a call to action to Scotland's businesses. We asked them to think what they could do to support the flow of supplies and equipment to our health and social care sector. And I can tell you that to date, more than 1,600 businesses and individuals have answered that call. And I want to thank each and every one of them today. We're working hard right now to assess and coordinate each of these offers as quickly as possible. And in doing that, of course, prioritising the support that is most needed. So our work, for example, with Calichem, which is a company based in Grangemouth, is an illustration of this. They have now produced 20,000 litres of hand sanitizer. The sanitizer was manufactured using denatured alcohol from White and Mackay. It was bottled by a Stonehaven-based company, McPhee, and deliveries of the product to our frontline services will begin from next week. The Scottish Government has formed this supply chain in an incredibly short space of time, and it will produce 560,000 litres of hand sanitizer over the next 4 weeks, and that will be enough to meet the needs of Scotland's entire health and social care sector. Another example is what we're doing with the firm Alpha Solway. They're producing 20,000 face visors every day from their factory in Annan, and in total they're supplying an order of over 1 million visors to our NHS. So these businesses and many more like them are doing hugely important work. Rightly and properly, we have and will continue to talk about getting supplies of this kind of equipment to the front line. But I thought it was useful today to give you an insight into the work that's being done to ensure that these supplies keep flowing and that we have sufficient of them to get through this crisis. So these companies and many more, in addition to the ones I've mentioned today, are playing a critical part in our overall collective national endeavour in Scotland to tackle this crisis. And I want to put on record today my heartfelt thanks to each and every one. Let me close today by just saying something about this weekend. I'm conscious, as all of you will be, that this will be the 5th weekend since the country went into lockdown. And I know that this only gets harder as time goes on. I know also that this weekend will be particularly difficult for Scotland's Muslim communities who are now observing the holy month of Ramadan, and I wish Ramadan Mubarak to all of you. This will be tough for our Muslim communities not to be able to host people in their homes or visit friends and family or to attend local mosques. And the Justice Secretary, who is himself observing Ramadan, will say a bit more about that shortly. But I want to end by emphasising that the sacrifices everybody is making, and these are big sacrifices, are having a positive impact. There's no doubt that we've got a long way to go. I shared some of that with you yesterday. But it is equally true to say that we are seeing hopeful signs. And so it is really vital that we stick with it and build on the work that we've done so far. Because by doing that, we are right now slowing the spread of this virus. We are protecting our National Health Service. And despite the horrible statistics I report to you on a daily basis, we are nevertheless saving lives. So thank you from the bottom of my heart to all of you for playing your part in doing that. Let me now hand over briefly to Professor Jason Leitch, our National Clinical Director, who's going to say a few words before I hand over to the Justice Secretary.
Thank you, First Minister. Following on from the First Minister's final point, and before Mr Yousaf talks a little more about Ramadan, I wanted to acknowledge the outstanding contribution of Scotland's faith communities during these very difficult weeks. Their commitment to helping others is always evident, but it is even more appreciated right now. I have seen amazing examples of community help from many faith groups all over the country. We recognise the difficulty in being able to come together or attend your place of worship, and I've also seen wonderful examples of faith groups learning how to gather virtually using Zoom or FaceTime or whatever mechanism they happen to use. However, our faith communities are resilient. You have demonstrated that by helping those most in need and finding new ways to communicate, you could continue that resilience. Faith is such an important part of many people's lives, and the ability to come together to celebrate festivals, including Ramadan, is often key to that. But we know that faith communities recognise these restrictions are vital. We continue to engage with faith leaders all over the country and communities and support them. We've funded a number of faith organisations to support engagement with their congregations, as well as to provide food and other necessities where that's required. We remain committed to those faith communities. It also gives me an opportunity to move from them to a perhaps group of people who are not often celebrated within our health and social care community, and that's our spiritual care and chaplaincy teams, who provide support and comfort to patients and families 365 days, 24/7. Chaplains, like many in our health and social care environments, have had to find new ways of working, and the right balance between showing up on the ward and offering safe support, often no longer face-to-face. A huge amount of this work has been done by telephone or video conferencing, particularly for staff and bereavement support. When a patient sadly dies, chaplains have been giving invaluable emotional and spiritual support to patients, families and staff, passing on messages and ensuring every effort is made to involve families as much as we can with the restrictions in place. I genuinely want to thank those teams of chaplains and spiritual carers across our health and social care system. My final point leads me to funerals, and you have heard us say from this podium a number of times how hard it is for us to have those funerals restricted. But we recognise how important ritual and gatherings are for people grieving the passing of a loved one, particularly at a time like this. However, those attending a funeral service should be kept to an absolute minimum and direct family, and those there should, if they're in different households, keep the 2-metre physical distancing if they possibly can. Where possible, I would urge all those unable to attend to view them in some other way. And organisations who help with funerals all over the country are now in a place to advise you about how to do that. So once again, thank you for everything that you're doing.
Thank you, Jason, and my thanks as well to add to that. Let me hand over now to Humza Yousaf, the Justice Secretary.
Thank you, First Minister. Let me begin by thanking people across the country who continue to comply with lockdown measures, obey the rules and follow the government's guidance. I cannot emphasise enough the importance of these measures, the importance that they're having in helping us to save lives, reduce the infection rate and indeed reduce the spread of the virus. Police Scotland are to be commended in the role that they play in ensuring physical distancing is being complied with, which of course has been our central public health response to this crisis. Police Scotland have taken a common sense approach. They have sought to engage, educate, encourage, and only as a last resort to use enforcement action. Latest figures from Police Scotland, which I received yesterday afternoon, confirmed the total action between the 28th of March and the 22nd of April in relation to non-compliance with the legislation is as follows. 27 premises have been closed, 3,646 compliant dispersals, 5 medical detentions, 1,009 dispersals after warning, 1,637 fixed penalty notices, 112 persons forcibly taken home, and 78 persons arrested for failing to disperse. I must emphasise that these have been the minority of interactions, the vast majority of interactions. We have seen people comply with the regulations and indeed with the instructions from Police Scotland. I speak regularly with the Chief Constable of Police Scotland, and I'm reassured and pleased to report that compliance with regulations remains very high. And I thank the people of Scotland for the continued recognition of our shared responsibility in dealing with the ongoing challenges of COVID-19. Going forward, I urge everyone to act in a way that helps to curb, curtail and control the virus. During this time, we've all been asked to stay at home. But unfortunately, for many people, home is not a safe haven. Those suffering domestic abuse, including coercive and controlling behaviours, can feel isolated and vulnerable. They can feel unheard and unseen. I want to stress that help and support is available 24/7 by, of course, calling the police, but also calling Scotland's domestic abuse helpline on 0800 027 1234. Help is available and you are not alone. We are taking a cross-governmental approach alongside our stakeholders. They include local authorities, support and advice organisations such as Scottish Women's Aid, and of course Police Scotland, to explore what more we can do to ensure that anyone who is suffering from abuse, in whatever form it may be, can reach vital support services and get the help they vitally need. My message is unequivocal. Regardless of how busy Police Scotland are, if you feel threatened or are in fear of harm, you should call the police. They will take and are taking a zero tolerance approach to domestic abuse, and you will get the help and support that you need. Finally, as the First Minister mentioned, I wanted to say just a few words about Ramadan, which I myself am observing and of course is being observed by Muslim communities right across Scotland. This Ramadan will be challenging. Ramadan by its nature in normal times involves social interaction. We break fast with family and friends. I know the first fast of the month, which is today, normally in normal times, I would be breaking with my parents and with my siblings. In normal times, we pray as a congregation every single day. However, this Ramadan will have to be different. The laws, regulations and guidelines must continue to be followed to help us protect the NHS and crucially save lives. This will be hard, but we will continue to connect with each other by other means, such as by using various digital platforms. So my message is a clear one. Fast at home, pray at home, stay at home, and help us protect the NHS and help us to save lives. Ramadan Mubarak to you all.
Thank you very much indeed, Humza. We'll now go straight to questions. We have the usual long list, but we will get through all of them. Fiona Walker from BBC Scotland is first.
Thank you, First Minister. The UK government has announced testing to be expanded for more essential workers. When's that going to happen here in Scotland? Who will those essential workers be? Like, for example, will it include supermarket and other key shop workers? And why can't expanded testing happen straight away if we're not using our full capacity every day?
We're ready to go live in Scotland with the system that the UK government announced today. I understand, and it's perhaps not surprising given the scale of the demand, that the digital portal has had some technical difficulties this morning and is currently not operating as it tries to process that demand. But we are ready to go live. We're ready to issue guidance about the categories of critical workers that will be able to access testing in this way, and guidance to employers about exactly how they access it. There'll be different groups, priority groups. Health and social care workers in Scotland will continue to be given access to testing in the normal way through health boards right now. Second group will be essential workers in critical national infrastructure, which is fundamental for safety and security and lifeline services. There'll be a third group, staff directly involved in delivering other essential services, and a fourth priority group, staff involved in volunteering or nationally or locally in significant industry that's important to the economy. So we will be sending out some more guidance that gives clarity on who's included in that and how employers and employees can access that. But we will wait until the system itself has stabilised and that the current technical difficulties that it is experiencing have been resolved. In terms of where that fits into our overall approach to testing, this is in addition to the processes and systems around testing that are currently operating in Scotland. We have got the target of 3,500 capacity of tests by the end of this month, and we are over and above what I've just set out there. We are working to make sure that we're using that full capacity through extending in some ways the three priority groups we previously set out, but also as we look increasingly forward to a test, trace, isolate component of our future strategy, how we build the bridge to that, and we'll continue to update the public on that as that work develops. Sharon Frew from STV. Sharon, can you hear us? Sharon, we're not hearing you. Can I maybe go to the next question? I will come back to you and give you a moment to sort out the... We're not hearing you, Sharon, sorry. I'll come back to you, okay? But if I can go just now to Alan Smith from Bauer while Sharon resolves... we're all having technical problems today, I think. Alan Smith from Bauer.
Yeah, thank you, First Minister. Just a question for Professor Leitch. I was just wondering what you've made of this research from the US, which claims to show that coronavirus weakens when exposed to sunlight and heat, and what you've made of suggestions from Donald Trump about UV light treatment and injecting disinfectant into the body?
So I have some confidence in the decision makers that I and my colleagues are advising. I can be absolutely certain I don't need to advise the present First Minister that injecting disinfectant into your body will be no help for coronavirus. There is, however, research going on all over the world, some of that involving drugs, some of that involving vaccines, and some of that involving disinfectant-type things for surfaces and other parts of our infrastructure. They are interesting. Scotland is involved in many of them, and we're certainly watching what happens around the world. But I can categorically say, and it is genuinely a serious point, at times of non-coronavirus and coronavirus, that disinfectant is for surfaces, not for bodies.
Can I say, there's a big responsibility on all leaders right now. There's always a responsibility on leaders, but it's greater than ever during a crisis like this. And I've said it today, I said it yesterday, I'm really keen that we have an open discussion with the public, and that politicians, unusually perhaps, are prepared to admit things they don't know, as well as share the thinking on the things that we do know and are trying to work through. But the responsibility on leaders is not to stand up in a public platform and repeat things that you have perhaps half heard and perhaps completely misunderstood, and present that to the public in a way that the public might act on, and that could be dangerous. And none of us are perfect. We will all make mistakes in this, but I think we all have to remember that very serious responsibility when we're giving advice to the public. It must be good advice, informed by the best science. And as Jason has just said, it is clearly not the case that ingesting disinfectant in any way, shape or form is a good idea. It is a very, very bad idea and extremely dangerous. Can we see if Sharon Frew is able to
Hi
be
there,
heard
First
now?
Minister.
Yeah, well,
Apologies for the technical issues. I just wanted to go back to the area of about enforcement. We've heard from Police Scotland who say that there's a small minority of people who are repeatedly flouting the lockdown rules. Do you accept the longer that this goes on, the harder this is going to be to enforce, and the compliance that the Justice Minister spoke about earlier just will be not as high?
I'll hand over to Humza in a second. Let me just say again, I've been so completely and utterly impressed by the magnificent response of the public, and maybe I shouldn't have been, because everybody wants to do the right thing in a difficult situation like this. But I've worried about compliance all along, and I guess I worry about it more with every day that passes, because all of us know that it gets more and more difficult. But my experience is that the public want to do the right thing. And what I think is important, if we're asking the public to continue to do really difficult things, is that we are very open about why we're asking you to do that, what the reasons are, so that you can make informed decisions for yourselves about why it is important to do that. And that goes back to the importance of the very open discussion that we're seeking to have. But Humza, can maybe just say a little bit more about how these enforcement statistics that you gave fit into the wider context.
Thank you, First Minister. So again, to reiterate, Police Scotland have said consistently and over the period of weeks that the vast majority of people are complying. And actually, from the statistics that I read out, even once people have been approached by Police Scotland, the compliant dispersals are by far the highest category. But I heard DCC Malcolm Graham, who's leading this effort on behalf of Police Scotland alongside the Chief Constable, and he was right to say that there are a small minority, and I must emphasise it is a small minority, who are continuing to act in a selfish manner. DCC Malcolm Graham also made the point that we're still having some problems with, for example, house parties and gatherings in people's houses. And the First Minister's emphasised why it's important for us all to comply with the guidelines, the regulations and the law. And in her opening remarks, she gave some glimmers of good news on how the measures we're taking are working. And they will only continue to work and have a greater effect, hopefully, in the future if we comply. So the compliance is good. Police Scotland will continue to take a common sense approach. They're not intending to change that approach. They will continue to use enforcement only as a last resort. But my thanks to them for that approach. My thanks again to the vast majority of the Scottish public who are complying.
Thanks, Humza. Phil McDonald from Global.
First Minister, I was wondering if I could ask about the shipment of PPE and testing kits that has just arrived at Prestwick. How regular will these shipments be? How long will this supply last? And where might it be distributed? Will it be in places like hospitals and care homes, etc.?
This is one shipment. We will have shipments and consignments coming into Scotland as regularly as we can source them from the markets that we're seeking to source them from, as well as the domestic production that we're trying to increase, and I gave some examples of that. They will go into the stockpiles, they will be distributed where they are needed. In terms of how long things will last, that will depend, of course, on the existing stockpile. We have numbers of what's in our stockpile, what's been distributed, what the demand usage is. But as I've said before, to give these numbers now, they're out of date very quickly because of the usage and demand. So suffice to say, we are working hard to get the supplies we need, to make sure that they are there, that they are distributed effectively, and that we're taking all steps to replenish those supplies when needed. I've said repeatedly, and I'll say again, there's no complacency around this. These supplies are under global pressure. All countries are trying to maximise what they've got. There are particular items, gowns have been mentioned in the last couple of weeks, goggles. These are the things that right now are under most pressure, but we continue to try to access supplies as quickly as possible and make sure that frontline staff have what they need. But this is something that is literally under constant monitoring by the government, and I would take the opportunity to thank those at National Services Scotland, which is our national procurement agency, because they are literally working around the clock to make sure that these supplies keep flowing. Conor Gillis from BBC Radio Scotland.
Thanks very much, First Minister. Just again on policing, the police say that the bulk of arrests and fines have been because of house parties, and you touched on that a minute ago as well, and also public gatherings. How concerning is it that people continue to have these parties? Do we have any examples of that? And Justice Secretary, you said that police have had to shut down 27 non-essential businesses. What can you tell us about that? And also the fact that some music festivals are still continuing to sell tickets for the end of July.
Let me take a couple of those points and then I'll hand over to Humza on the direct question to him. On festivals and big events, I was pretty clear yesterday that while there's a lot of uncertainty about where we are heading in the future and decisions still to be taken, there should be no expectation that large-scale gatherings and events will be able to happen over the next few months. And I know event organisers are working hard to be responsible in how they move forward from that. In terms of house parties, the Chief Constable, when he joined me at one of these briefings, I think 2 weeks ago today on Good Friday, gave an example of a house party or a house gathering where police officers had told them to disperse and had come back later and they hadn't, and there had to be some arrests there. So these will be the kind of things that the police in a minority of cases are dealing with. But let me say directly to people, don't have house parties. Don't gather outside your own household in people's houses, because you're putting yourselves at risk. And even if you think that you're young and fit and healthy and you're safe from this virus, well, firstly, you're wrong. Nobody is safe from getting this virus, and nobody who gets it can guarantee they won't get seriously ill or even die. But even if I can't convince you of that, think about your relatives, think about your grandparents or your elderly parents or people that you might leave that house party and come into contact with that are not as young and fit and healthy as you are. So you're putting yourself at risk, but you're putting other people at risk. And one of the things, this is a grim, difficult, horrible time, but I think we've all seen real community spirit emerge out of this tough time. So think about that. We're all trying to do the right thing for ourselves and each other. And every time anybody breaches these guidelines and these rules, you're breaching that and you're putting people's lives at risk. So just don't do it, is my message. Humza.
Yeah, not much to add, First Minister, other than to answer your question directly, Conor. Yes, it is worrying, continues to be a source of worry and concern. I think, again, every Monday, the Chief Constable and I and DCC Malcolm Graham make sure we speak so we can talk over the events of the weekend. And the Monday call coming up will be very, very interesting indeed, because as the First Minister referenced, this is the fifth weekend of lockdown. We know the weather is generally due to be quite good across the country, and therefore it will be really important to see if we're picking up better compliance, or indeed, if regrettably the situation is becoming even more challenging. So that will be interesting in that regard. In terms of the business premises, a reminder that it's not just Police Scotland, but also, of course, local authorities have enforcement powers over businesses as well. In terms of the detail of those businesses, they're varied, the 27. It would be fair to say that when approached by be it police or local authorities, those businesses have closed and been quick to close. But what they all have in common is, of course, they are not essential in terms of fighting, in terms of our fight against this virus. So that's why they have been told to close, and that enforcement action will continue to be taken if there's any businesses that are flouting those guidelines.
Okay, thank you. Joe Matthews from Sky.
Thanks, First Minister. You said that the day before yesterday, 2,000 people had been tested. That actually involves 1,500, you said there were 2,000 tests the day before yesterday. That actually involved 1,500 people. So more than 500 people had to be retested. Why did they have to be retested? What does that tell us about the reliability of the test? And what are the implications for tests going forward, given the number who need to be reliably tested?
What you've just described to me there is not unusual or anything that we would not have been completely frank about. Some people, for a variety of reasons, I'll hand over to Jason, who'll be able to give a bit more technical content to this answer, but there'll be a variety of reasons why people need more than one test. I mean, I can't remember if you were at the briefing the other day where, or perhaps, I think this was the Health Secretary in Parliament, forgive me, said that we're now going to ensure that people leaving hospital, going to a care home, have to have 2 negative tests before they do it. So sometimes you'll just want to be sure that somebody is negative. So that is not unusual and has been the case throughout. All of that is factored into our plans to build up the capacity to the extent that we need to, not just so that we can meet the objectives and requirements for testing right now, but increasingly so that we can meet the objectives and requirements for testing as we go into the next phase, which are not exactly the same as they are right now. So that's all factored into our thinking and our planning. Jason?
I would only add, First Minister, that this test, as we all know now, works in a specific window of the patient's clinical journey. And if the clinicians are treating somebody with suspected symptoms and the test comes back negative, it may be that that patient stays in hospital and they still suspect COVID is the cause, and they will retest. And they may do that more than once. Infection tests that look for the DNA of the virus are notoriously difficult because of that window of opportunity. It is unfortunately not like going for a chest x-ray. You put it up and somebody clever reports on it. That's just not how infection testing works. And the present test we have is reliable, but not 100% for the whole clinical journey.
Jim, you're trying to come back in.
Jason, is the test itself 100%?
No test for DNA is 100%, but this test is very, very good at what it does. But it is not good outside that window of being able to find the virus. It's a cotton bud down your throat and up your nose. It has to find DNA of the virus. Sorry to be slightly disgusting at lunchtime. But what we actually need on an ongoing basis is therefore an antibody test, a blood test that would find genetic material, antibodies inside your blood. That test, as yet, is unavailable worldwide.
Okay, thank you. Neil Puran from PA.
Thank you, First Minister. Yesterday, Matt Hancock also talked about the need to step up recruitment of contact tracers. And I was wondering if that process had begun in Scotland and if we know exactly how many contact tracers are going to be required.
So that work is underway in Scotland. I remember setting this out to somebody yesterday. I can't remember if it was as I was standing here or in another interview. We're going through a process right now of working out what testing capacity we'll need for a test, trace, isolate strategy. That, to some extent, is dependent on where we think the prevalence of the virus will be, so the numbers of people who are likely to be symptomatic and will require testing. In terms of contact tracing, we then have to think about what's the average number of contacts somebody like that might have come into, and that will be influenced by the degree of social distancing that we still have in place. If we still have, as we are very likely to, rules that say to people limit who you're coming into contact with outside your own household, that average number might be smaller than it would be in normal times. And it's from those kind of assumptions that we make that we assess how many contact tracers are we going to need to do this. That work is underway, and that then obviously feeds through into the recruitment and the training of those people. And that's what we'll report on in more detail in the days to come. But I want to give an assurance that it is underway within the Scottish Government and will intensify as we go through the next period. Derek Keeley from the Courier.
Thank you, First Minister. Earlier this week, the Scottish Government said it would take steps to ensure retired doctors and medical students working on the front line qualify for death and service benefits. Public sector care workers who die of coronavirus while working against the disease currently do not receive that benefit. I understand the Scottish Government is currently considering the issue, but workers continue to put themselves in harm's way while this is decided. I know it's a real concern for staff and for unions. Would you personally support a death and service benefit for care workers, and when can we expect an update on this matter?
The Health Secretary has been looking closely at this, and in short, we want to get a solution that makes sure everybody who's working on the front line of our health service has the protection, not just the physical protection, but the broader protection that they need. So we'll happily get an update to you on where exactly that is and when we expect that issue to be resolved, but it's one that we attach a great deal of importance to. Tom Peterkin from the P&J.
Good afternoon, First Minister. Your document published yesterday talks about services having to change. It seems to suggest quite a radical approach coming when eventually we do come out of this virus. Would that include finding ways to pay carers more than they are currently paid? Many are still being paid less than £10 an hour. Willie Rennie suggested a £129 a day sort of military-style allowance. These are people who are obviously in the front line. Do they not deserve to be better rewarded?
I think people in the front line of our health service and care sector absolutely deserve to be fairly and properly rewarded. Before coronavirus, we in Scotland have had a long-standing commitment to the living wage and to fair pay for people in our public services. For many people working in the health and care sector, they will be paid more in Scotland than they perhaps might be in other parts of the UK. But suffice to say, and there's lots of suggestions being made, which we are thinking about and considering, this crisis, and none of us would have chosen to have it, I think is making all of us think afresh about what really matters in life, who really matters, what jobs and what work really matters, and how we then reflect that in the decisions we might take about the future. There was, you referred to the paper we published yesterday. Towards the end of that paper, we say something along the lines of, when things fall apart, it's always really difficult, but it gives you the opportunity to put them back together in a better way. And that's the opportunity we will have on a whole range of issues. And I certainly, when we get to the point where we're not day to day in a fight against this virus, being able to think about how we do things better in the future than we have perhaps done in the past. And the role and the reward of people who work in the front line of our public services will definitely be a key part of that discussion. Chris Musson from The Sun.
Hi, First Minister. You spoke this morning about a potential bubble policy like in Belgium as lockdown is eased, where people could essentially stick to meeting a small group of others outside their own households. And from the way you were speaking, it sounds like it's something that you are looking at in some detail. So can you tell us how likely do you think it is that you could allow this? And secondly, could it be a way that grandparents could see grandchildren, for example, or do you think that they would be excluded from such a scheme as they are potentially vulnerable?
So it's a good question. And I suppose what I'd say is we're looking at lots of different things in detail, and I'm just a little bit cautious about, I'm about to allow myself to be taken down your line of questioning, but I always want to preface it, but because you've asked me about this particular issue and I'm about to go into a bit more detail of that, please don't at home think that's the one thing that we're thinking about ahead of all other things. We're not at that stage yet. We're assessing and modelling and thinking about all sorts of options. And remember the objective here. It's to try to get as much normality as possible back, recognising it will not be normality as we knew it while we still control the virus. So if you take the bubble policy that I talked about, some countries are effectively looking at how people could slightly more widely define their household. So right now we're saying to people, don't mix outside your own household. So we're asking people already to live pretty much within their household bubble. Could you expand that to, one friend or a couple of friends, particularly if you live on your own? Is there somebody else who lives on their own that you could start to physically meet with, as long as it's just you two and you're not expanding that with each day that passes? So it's about redefining the bubbles that we're enabling people to live within, so that they're not quite as isolated as they are just now. Now, there may be relevance generally to that, but as you say, I think that is of particular relevance to people right now who are on their own and who are understandably missing that physical human contact. So these are all things we're thinking through to try to make life just a bit less difficult and a bit more normal than it is just now. But these have to be carefully done. And I don't want to quash what you said about grandparents, because I don't want to quash anything that might prove to be possible. But the word of caution I would give there is, we know it's older people who are particularly vulnerable to this virus. 9 out of 10 of the people who've died in this virus are over 65. So we've got to be particularly careful that we continue to protect that most vulnerable group in the population. And you know, I know from my own parents how difficult it is for grandparents not to be seeing their grandchildren, but this is about trying to make sure that grandparents are around to see their grandkids grow up, and that's why these really difficult things are proving to be necessary. But suffice to say, consistent with continuing to suppress the virus, I want to find as many ways as possible that we can just make life a bit easier for people than it is right now, and that's very much going to be the focus of our considerations in the days and weeks to come. Libby Brooks from The Guardian.
Hello, First Minister. This morning, Arlene Foster reiterated that Northern Ireland could leave lockdown a bit earlier than the rest of the UK. You've got the Welsh First Minister, Mark Drakeford, is publishing his own framework for leaving lockdown just now. But this morning, Matt Hancock also said that it remains his preference for the four nations to work as one on easing restrictions. And I wanted to know how realistic you think that preference is now, and whether you have any concerns about a four-way differentiated approach to leaving lockdown.
As I've said before, I don't take a predetermined or certainly not in any sense an ideological or political view of this. I just want to do what's right to best tackle this virus. And I think for reasons I've set out before, and I think I have a regular call. I spoke yesterday on the phone to Mark, Arlene, Michelle O'Neill, the Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, and Sadiq Khan. We regularly speak together just to assess where we are and some of the options for the future. And I can't speak for any of them, but I suspect all of us would say the same thing. For the fact that the virus doesn't respect borders and boundaries, and for simplicity of messaging, I think the more consistency we have in what we are advising people to do, the easier and better that will be. But the most important thing is that each of us, discharging our own responsibilities, are confident that what we're asking people to do is the right thing in terms of suppressing the virus. So that's what will guide me in all of this. Now, if I think other governments are taking decisions that are prematurely coming out of lockdown and risking a resurgence of the virus, then it stands to reason I would not be keen to do that in Scotland. And I'm sure vice versa. If they thought I was taking decisions that weren't right, they would not be keen to replicate that. Or if the advice tells us that we're at different stages of the infection curve and therefore something different might help us suppress it, I think it would be wrong not to have our minds open to that. But it's not I've said before, I don't come at this from either we must stick to a UK-wide position or we must have a separate Scottish position. The only position that matters to me is the one that best tackles this virus and stops it infecting people and stops it taking people's lives. And I'm pretty sure all of the other three governments across the UK are in exactly the same position there. And of course, we're all from different political parts of the spectrum, but I think that's what is guiding all of us, and that is what should continue to guide us. Chris McCall from The Scotsman.
Yes, good afternoon, First Minister. You've spoken previously about the need for consistent messaging when it comes to public health advice during the pandemic. Now, with that in mind, would you encourage people in Scotland of the importance to pay attention only to Scottish and UK authorities and not to leaders overseas who may be spreading harmful conspiracies on this?
I think Jason and I have both covered, I think, the issue that you may be alluding to here, and these are serious issues. I'm not going to give in to the temptation to be too light-hearted about this, but it is not any form of advice coming from the Scottish Government, or I think any government across the world, that disinfectant ingested into the body is either an acceptable way of dealing with this virus or in any way a safe way. Now, what I said earlier on is that, all of us as leaders, I think every leader in every country across the world, large, small, medium-sized, is finding themselves in uncharted territory here. It's not easy. The decisions we've taken, the decisions we will take, it's tough. And all of us will get things wrong. But there is a big responsibility on our shoulders to listen to the advice we are given, to apply our own judgment to that, because we are responsible as politicians for taking the decisions and being accountable and responsible for them. But not standing up at a podium and just coming out with something that you might have half heard and misunderstood, when the consequences of that could be really serious. So on the issue of disinfectant, Jason, with a much more scientific ability than I can, made it very clear. Bleach and Dettol and disinfectant is for cleaning viruses off of surfaces. It's not for ingesting into the body in any way, shape or form. Vivian Aitken from the Daily Record.
Good afternoon, First Minister. Last night, after we all applauded our NHS, I spoke to a distraught nurse. For weeks, they have sat comforting patients for their entire shift who were dying from COVID-19. But today, that same NHS bank worker is at home with no work and no money to feed their family. I'm sure it was not an intended consequence of the redeployment of other staff to ease these valued bank workers out of the work they have loyally done for years, but is a consequence nonetheless. The nurse tells me those redeployed, mainly from mothballed clinics, have no ward experience and, in the main, no desire to be in COVID wards. The nurse and fellow bank workers fear for the safety of the staff and patients. So my questions are, is there actually any financial help available for these specific workers? And is the clinical director certain with redeployment that we have the right staff in the right place at the right time?
I'll hand over to Jason to answer the question about how we ensure that the staff that are on our wards and looking after people in health and care are, qualified and trained for that job, and that we have the right numbers and mix at any one time. On the first part of your question, I frequently say this. I want anybody to feel, if they have an issue where they're not being treated fairly right now, if they're doing a job like the one you've described and they're not being treated fairly, whether that's PPE or any other way, to be able to feel they can come to us, and if we can work through that and resolve that. And I would say again to journalists, please, if people are contacting you, you're absolutely entitled, and it's perfectly legitimate to ask us here at the briefing, but make sure you're also giving these people the opportunity to pass their details on to us so that we can try and address some of these practical issues. I don't know the detail of the individual that you've mentioned today, so I can't really go into any more detail in my answer to that, but I'm very happy on all of these situations to look into these issues, and where we can resolve a matter, then we will try hard to do it. Jason, do you want to take on the wider question?
My job in the months and years before this has been to have some policy responsibility and operational responsibility for the safety and quality of our delivery system. That job remains my job now. I am absolutely confident that those in our wards doing inductions for new staff, those still in charge of the Scottish Patient Safety Programme in our intensive care units, which have expanded but have kept in the same processes to reduce infection, to be safe and person-centred, even in this new world, are intact. I speak and even visit some of my colleagues inside these units all over the country, and I am absolutely confident that the staffing levels are right, that the processes in place have had to change, of course, because of visiting or because of other restrictions, but they are robust. And Scotland has and continues to have one of the safest healthcare systems in the world.
Thank you, Jason. And the last question today is David Ball from the Herald.
Thank you, First Minister. Before the lockdown was introduced, there was talk from your officials over concern about lockdown fatigue if the restrictions were in place for too long. Is that still a concern of the Scottish Government as we approach the 5th weekend? And from an enforcement perspective, Is the sort of good weather putting more pressure on police to be able to disperse groups? And will enforcement be hampered if restrictions are turned on and off at short notice in the next phase?
Well, we set out in the paper yesterday that the potential, if we lift restrictions and then find that the virus is getting out of control, to have to put them back on. And part of the reason we're talking about this is not because we want to do it and we hope we won't be in that position, but again, to just make sure people understand the complexities and uncertainties of the path that lies ahead. On the first part of your question, yes, it will always be a concern that with every day that passes, people find it harder and harder to comply with these restrictions. I'm finding it harder to, not see my family and to comply with some of this. Every single individual across the country will be experiencing that, and some will be finding it much harder. I've said before, but it's worth repeating, that if you live in a big house with a garden, this is a different experience to living in a flat with 3 children and not much space to move about in. So this is really, really tough, but people know why we're asking them to do it, which is why I think compliance has been so high. And my judgment and my sort of estimate here is that if we continue to be open and frank with people about the reasons for these restrictions, then people will continue to comply because they know it is in the wider interest and in their own interest. Where I think any government will run into difficulty is if we're asking people to do things and people don't understand why, and they're not necessarily convinced that it is the right thing to do or that it has the desired effect. And that is another reason why I'm so keen for this discussion to be as open and frank as it possibly can be. And one of the things I'm conscious of is that as we go into a phase where we may be lifting some things but not others, that message inevitably gets more complicated. Right now, the message I have to give you every day, and it's still the message today, is stay at home unless you go out for essential purposes. If that message suddenly becomes a little bit more nuanced, we have to take more care in how we get that across, and obviously that becomes a more challenging thing for the police to enforce as well. So these are all the things that we have to consider as we go forward. But I know people say, are you worried about lockdown fatigue? People are already fatigued about this. I know that people are, but if we stop doing it right now, then we're very quickly going to run into something a lot worse, which is the numbers I'm giving you here about hospital admissions and intensive care admissions and people dying from this virus are going to start to go up again very quickly and very steeply. And none of us want to see that happen, which is why we must keep sticking with this right now. Do you want to say any more about enforcement before we finish, Humza?
No, just to add, First Minister, that of course Police Scotland are a key partner of ours, and they're very much at the forefront of ensuring that those physical distancing measures are complied with. And of course, the First Minister and the government will take scientific advice, will take medical advice, but also the intelligence that we receive from police officers on the ground right across the country is hugely important to the decisions that we have to make. And having a single police force with a single command structure means we can have a real consistency of message right across the country. And so far, and this will undoubtedly continue, we've seen real alignment between the messages coming from the Chief Constable, the First Minister, and the more, of course, that will continue, regardless of what the situation is in relation to restrictions. Of course, the clearer the message will be.
Thank you very much. That concludes the questions that we have today. Can I thank Jason and Humza for joining me here today. Can I thank our signer again, and thank all of you. I think given the topics we've been discussing today, I would just like to echo Jason's thanks to our spiritual and chaplaincy services across health and care who do such an important job day in and day out at all times, but particularly right now. And also to record again my thanks to Police Scotland, who are doing a difficult job, but doing it very sensitively and very effectively right now. So thank you to all of them and to everybody else who is helping to keep the country going through these really difficult times. But particularly thanks to all of you watching at home who, as the weather does get better, are doing the right thing, even although it's really, really tough. And I'm so grateful to you because that is why I'm able to stand here right now and report still some very difficult news, but news that in some respects is getting a little bit better. The Health Secretary will lead the weekend briefing on Sunday, and I will be back here with you on Monday. In the meantime, in the circumstances, as much as you can, have a good weekend. Thank you very much for joining us.